This is TWiT.
You wrote an article, Danny, called Rights That Are Being Forgotten, a play on the European Union's right to be forgotten ruling. And you and Jillian New York wrote this really interesting piece that talked about some of the other things that are being sacrificed in the quest for privacy in Europe under this ruling. And we'd like to talk about it with you for a few minutes if you like. Now, it's your day off, and I appreciate you coming on today and joining us on your day off. So
it's totally fine. I like talking about this sort of stuff on my day off as well. So we wrote the piece because I think this is one of those examples where there are considerations about privacy and considerations about free speech, and sometimes they butt against one another. And our concern with the way that the right to be forgotten has been interpreted in the CCJ decision, and by Google, because I think Google's had a lot of leeway in how it might implement this stuff, has meant that the right of free expression has been kind of missed. And I think that's going to become a bigger problem as more and more companies feel they have to adopt protocols to take into account this decision.
Now, you talked about three victims of this ruling, and I'd like to go through them if you don't mind. The first one was that the first victim, you said, of this ruling is Google's implementation of the ECJ's, the European Court of Justice's decision, which is transparency under censorship. What did you mean by that? How is transparency under censorship being victimized here?
So let's go back a million or so years to 2001, and Google in its early idealistic phases was bumping into some of its first challenges as a big search engine, and that was people in the US coming along and demanding that content be taken down, or in particular, links be taken down. And one of the most controversial of those cases was the Church of Scientology, which up until then had already attracted quite a reputation on the internet as being an organization big enough and concerned enough to demand that content be removed. So Google was trying to work out how to deal with these takedowns, and it set what I thought was an interesting precedent for big companies, in that Google took down the content because they were legally obliged to do so in the United States, but they put a little message at the bottom saying, you've typed in this search term, and we've had to remove some of the results, and click here to find out more. And you clicked there, and you went to Chilling Effects, a great site that EFF supports, that actually lists the court orders and the DMCA takedown requests that led to this removal. So you could get an idea of why things were being censored, who was doing it, and what the extent was. Something was missing, but you knew it was missing. The Google has done a similar thing with the implementation of this European Court of Justice requirement, but they've skipped on this. Actually, what they do is they put that notice at the bottom of search results in Europe, but they put it for everything that looks like a name. So if you type Danny O'Brien into google.co.uk, there will be a little message saying, oh, something might have been removed from this search. And in fact, that's not the case. I mean, I haven't put a request, neither of the 1,500 other Danny O'Briens in the world. It's just that Google has placed that in every single name request.
So as Donald Rumsfeld would say, it used to be a known unknown, and now it's an unknown unknown. And that's a real problem. Now, if you're just joining us, we're talking with Danny O'Brien, who's a technology journalist and civil liberties activist. He's also the international director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Why do you suppose Google is doing that? Is it because they want to get more publicity for the fact that they're being forced to do this, or is it just hard to do a warning for the specific search results, or do they just want to not antagonize the European authorities?
Well, so this has been the subject of a lot of press interest, in that there's been an open question whether Google is implementing this. Some people have said in sort of a deliberately clumsy way in order to increase opposition to it, or alternatively, they're implementing it in the only way that they know how, and the ruling is as bad as that, and there's nothing they can do about it. I don't have any particular insight into which one this plays out. I mean, I don't see Google as being pure as the driven snow in a lot of these cases. They have their own motivations. And as you know, working at the EFF, one thing I know is if you have your civil liberties decided by a big fight between the courts and a large corporation, it's really not your civil liberties that are being decided. It's what's being decided is, you know, the intent and motives of these companies.
Personally, and I don't know if you agree, Jeff and Gina, but I would love to see those big black bars as if somebody came in there with a Sharpie or something like that, and just so it'd be super obvious and really just mar the appearance of the entire search result
but of course, the problem with that is that, I mean, and Danny, I agree with you on this. I've spoken about this on the show, and in fact, when I wrote my book, Public Parts, a couple of years ago, I attacked this whole notion started by Vivian Redding of the European Commission of this right to be forgotten, and have raised a flag about the danger to speech that this raises. And now it's only proving to be the case. And last week we talked about Guardian and BBC stories being taken down, and then since then they went back up. I don't think Google is being cynical in this, but Google is absolutely stuck with a terrible ruling where there's no good way to do this. The irony of it is that many Europeans don't want Google to have more power, and the court only gave Google more power, and more power Google doesn't want in this case. But the Streisand effect irony of this is that if they said specifically, this is exactly what we took down, then of course they're going to get taken to court saying, well, you've just countermanded the point of the ruling and pointed to what was taken down. Google's in a no-win situation here.
I mean, there's a lot of, mind reading going on here. Like, Google says that it's trying to anticipate objections like that and build a system that works that way. Well, if you're in a situation where you're having to mind read the courts, the best thing to do is actually go to the courts and find out. And there are 29 data protection authorities in the EU. And we're in this curious position where Google has jumped in and started implementing this before the authorities have even said.
Danny, this was an unappealable decision. It was a final decision by the highest court, and Google had really no choice but to get going. There's no appeal back to lower authorities separately. The court said, this is a decision, that's it. There is no appeal. There is no choice. You have to do this. The only appeal that's going to come now is through legislators. And we have the Justice Minister of the UK saying today that there is no right to be forgotten. And I think we're going to see this fought out at different levels. But Google, I disagree. Google was stuck with having to go enforce something. And you also said in your piece that Bing is the alternative. As far as I understand the ruling, this was not specific to Google. This is Bing and Yahoo and other search engines that they've got to deal with the same thing. Google is just the first doing it.
Well, I was going to say I don't want to get into like dueling EU scholarship, but why not? Let's do it. So it is true that this is a court of last appeal, as it were. However, it doesn't quite work in the same way as the Supreme Court in the United States. What's happening here is that a lower court has gone up to the European Court of Justice and asked it a bunch of questions. And the European Court of Justice has given an answer to those questions. Now everything else begins to sort of roll out. That court, the lower court, will make a decision based on that answer, and data protection authorities and search engines like Google and like Bing will work out how to implement that. But it's not just a crack of lightning and everything changes. And my concern is really that, like, I actually want to hold the data protection authorities to account, because one of the things that we're profoundly worried about is that the entire regulatory space here is all about protecting privacy, which means that publishers like The Guardian, like the BBC, don't really have an obvious way of appealing this without going and begging Google to put this back. And as you've said...
in fact, there was no requirement that Google had to even notify them. I was delighted that Google notified The Guardian and the BBC of this. And yes, some may say that was a cynical act to get the PR, but whatever. There was, among the 70,000 takedown requests that were there was, one's 4 or 5 for the Guardian, one for the BBC, and they got notified, which means that they then did have the appeal of going to Google in the court of public opinion, and Google did change. We didn't even know how that was going to work out, whether Google was going to notify anyone that their free speech rights had just been affected by this fakakta ruling.
And Danny O'Brien, that was your second victim, which is the victim of the implementation of fairness. And you said that, Google, in fact, did go to the people with, as you said, as a bully pulpit, the press, essentially, which raises the question, yes, the press could sort of get Google to make a change, but can people who don't, buy digital ink by the barrel do that? Is it fair that the press has one set of rules and that the little people have a different set? And that was one of your points.
So it's interesting, the nitty-gritty of this particular case. I mean, one thing, and I cut the paragraph out of our essay just because it was getting huge, is that, in fact, the way that Google notifies people, and Jeff's absolutely right, it's great that they're doing this and they didn't have to do this, is through their Google Webmaster Tools system. So basically, if you use Google Analytics and you sign up to their service, you now get a little message when Google is removing links because of a privacy takedown request. This is weird in that it now means that you have to sign up to a Google service in order to find out whether your content is being removed. But the other part of this is that what is the appeal process here? It turns out that when Google put back some news items, it actually put back, I think, one news item that was due to them making a mistake. So it's not actually a sort of legal challenge that we're seeing here. It's just Google, as will inevitably be the case, making an error in its internal system. I mean, we deal with terrible problems with the DMCA copyright takedowns and Google's and other companies' implementation of their legal requirements under that. And at least the DMCA system has a legal method for someone to appeal this decision. And right
Danny,
now,
let me ask you about that. Let me ask you about that, because in a way, I was happy but unhappy that Google turned around and put some of the items back up for whatever reason. Because what I would like to see happen is for the likes of the Guardian and the BBC to bring their own free speech complaints, suits, that their rights have been impinged by this, and that we fight that out in that case. I don't know enough about European law and the structure and how that goes there, so I will concede defeat on any EU scholarship immediately to you. But what would it take? Could you imagine a case going for whether it's the Guardian or whether it's blogger Joe Schmo or being able to then have a complaint of their civil rights being violated, and how would they bring that?
So. What potentially could happen is that we're actually in the middle of reforming the data protection laws in Europe, and it's at a fairly late stage. So conceivably, they could add something to that, which would add a sort of right to appeal. But we're in, as everyone says, incredibly uncharted territories here, because there's never really been this face-off between privacy and free speech within the data protection system like this. And just very quickly, it didn't have to be this way. The Advocate General, who's sort of the research wing, as it were, of the European Court of Justice, published his report before the final decision and said what actually I think everybody, including Google, thought this decision was going to play out, which is the court saying that Google can't wriggle out of data protection requirements in Europe, but a free expression right trumps the requirement to sort of delete this data from the search index.
Indeed, Danny, I think you're right. I was brought to speak for travel, not for pay, to Google's privacy all hands in Mountain View about a day and a half after this decision came out, and as I've said on the show previously, they were gobsmacked. They did not expect this to come. But my European friends, when I was in Berlin a few weeks later, said, oh, well, they should have expected this to come.
You know, what I think everybody expected, and again, I've been speaking to people, is that Google had somewhat aggressively challenged the idea that they were susceptible to any European data protection requirements, because they said the Google search index is done out of Mountain View, and their Google Spain department just deals with ads. And I don't think that was ever going to fly. And I think what happened is they aggressively said that in the courts. And when this decision came down, a lot of people were so happy about Google actually being obliged to comply with European law that they didn't realize this really counterintuitive decision that the ECJ had sort of tacked on the end.
Now, Danny O'Brien, your third victim in your article and final victim was Europe's privacy law itself. You pointed out that, and you made a really interesting argument about censorship, and that any small step down the road of censorship causes information to essentially route around that censorship, forcing those who want to censor information to have ever more repressive forms of censorship, and then you go down into the wormhole of, you know, totalitarian dictatorship or something like that. But this is clearly a step towards censorship, right? And this kind of, that's the part of this that to me came kind of out of nowhere, that Europe would not only take a big step, what I think is a big step toward censorship, did it in such a clumsy way, did it in a way that seemed to be an available way. You can't just, you know, it would have been an entirely different proposition for them to go and have the articles removed from the Guardian website, for example.
Right.
And so this was the kind of a weaselly way, in my opinion, a kind of a weaselly way for them to get a similar effect. But as you pointed out, it's a step toward of censorship in an otherwise generally free society. What's next, do you think?
Well, the reason why we said that was because I'm really used to speaking to governments who have, in their eyes, a perfectly reasonable reason to try and censor and block content online. I mean, when we deal with, as we often do at the EFF, with the copyright industry, they'll say, you know, that we have a whole industry hanging on this. Piracy is rampant, and therefore we need to use this censorship tool to prevent our industries collapsing. Same thing when I talk to the Thai government, and they say, you know, we're in an environment where the country is being riven by civil unrest. We have to block and censor political speech. And the same thing's happening here. And all you can say in all of these cases is, look, this isn't going to work. And when you discover that it isn't going to work, you're going to double down, right? And this is what we saw with the copyright industry. And this is what we see in any country that tries to control what its people see. And the problem with that is you end up with this ridiculous situation where you have incredible fines, changing the entire internet infrastructure to comply with censorship requirements, and it still doesn't work. Essentially,
well said, Danny. Well said.
Everything that's being removed from Google's index is still out there. And I and any other sort of person who knows how to put together a script could write you a program that would find it. And in fact, of course, we've just highlighted what is seen as being valuable content by doing that. So it's not going away, and you can't half censor. Half censoring is like being half pregnant. It just doesn't work. And then we just go down this slippery slope.
All right. Well, Danny O'Brien is a technology journalist and civil liberties activist at the EFF and also the international director of said EFF. Thank you so much for coming on This Week in Google and telling us and discussing your article with us.
Thanks, Danny. Keep on beating the drum.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Thank you, Danny.